In 1622, a Portuguese colonial governor invited an African queen to a peace negotiation. He had one chair in the room, his own. The message was deliberate. She would stand before him like a subject. She would negotiate from below. She would enter his space on his terms and leave knowing her place. She looked at the room. She looked at her attendants. She ordered one of them to kneel on the floor. And then she sat on their back and negotiated as an equal. Her name was Nzinga Mbande, and for the next 4 decades, she would make the most powerful colonial empire in the world regret the day it decided she was manageable. This is the story of the African queen who built an empire while Europe was rewriting history to pretend she couldn't. To understand Nzinga, you have to understand what she was up against. By the early 17th century, Portugal had been operating on the African coast for over 150 years. They had built a system of slave trading that had already transported hundreds of thousands of Africans across the Atlantic. They had military technology, naval power, and the backing of the Catholic Church. They had conquered, colonized, and extracted from African territories across the continent. And they wanted Ndongo. The kingdom of Ndongo, in what is now northern Angola, was wealthy, strategically positioned, and resistant. Its rulers, the Angola, had maintained sovereignty against Portuguese pressure for decades. But by 1622, the Portuguese had been pushing harder. They had established the colonial city of Luanda on the coast. They were moving inland, and they had invited the Angola's sister, Nzinga, to negotiate terms of submission. That was their mistake. Nzinga did not come to Luanda to submit. She came to assess the enemy, buy time, and lay the groundwork for a resistance that would last the rest of her very long life. She converted to Christianity during that visit, taking the baptismal name Ana de Sousa after the governor's wife, not out of genuine conversion, but as a calculated diplomatic move. In a world where the Catholic Church had issued papal bulls authorizing the enslavement of non-Christians, baptism was armor. It complicated Portugal's legal justification for enslaving her people. She was thinking 3 moves ahead. Back home, her brother, the Angola, died under disputed circumstances, and Nzinga took power. The Portuguese refused to recognize her. Their position was that a woman could not rule Ndongo, that she had no legitimate claim, that they would install a ruler more amenable to their interests. They sent armies. They established puppet rulers. They applied every pressure they had. She fought back on every front simultaneously. Militarily, she reorganized the Ndongo army and adopted Portuguese tactics against them, learning from every engagement how they fought and adapting accordingly. She formed alliances with the Mbangala, a formidable group of warriors who had previously fought against her, recognizing that shared enemies made better allies than old resentments. She harassed Portuguese supply lines. She disrupted their slave trading operations. She made Ndongo expensive to hold. Diplomatically, she was without equal. She sent letters to Portuguese authorities, to the Vatican, to Dutch traders who were competing with Portugal for influence on the African coast. She played one European power against another with the sophistication of someone who understood the European political landscape better than many Europeans. When the Dutch arrived on the Angolan coast as rivals to Portugal, Nzinga negotiated an alliance with them, turning European competition into African leverage. When the Portuguese drove her out of Ndongo, she did not surrender. She moved east, conquered the neighboring kingdom of Matamba, and built a new power base from which she continued fighting. She turned Matamba into a sovereign African state that the Portuguese could not ignore, a kingdom that controlled significant trade routes and could not simply be absorbed. She was in her 40s when she lost Ndongo. She would spend the next 3 decades rebuilding, fighting, negotiating, and refusing to accept the terms Portugal wanted to impose. Historian Linda Haywood at Boston University, who has written the most comprehensive modern biography of Nzinga, describes her as one of the most sophisticated political and military leaders of the 17th century, not qualified by gender or continent, but by any standard, in any comparison, against any ruler of her time. And her time was the same time as Cardinal Richelieu in France, Gustavus Adolphus in Sweden, Oliver Cromwell in England, the figures European history books treat as the definitive statesmen and military commanders of the era. Nzinga operated at their level. She simply operated without the benefit of European historians writing her into the textbooks. Consider what she was managing simultaneously. She was running a kingdom while in exile. She was commanding a military campaign against a colonial power with superior weapons and naval support. She was conducting multi-front diplomacy with competing European powers. She was managing internal politics, keeping alliances together, handling succession questions, dealing with rivals who would gladly have made a separate peace with Portugal at her expense. And she was doing all of this while the Portuguese were actively running a propaganda campaign to delegitimize her, circulating the claim that she was illegitimate, unstable, dangerous, and unworthy of recognition. The same playbook colonialism always ran: delegitimize the leader, deny the sovereignty, install a friendly alternative. When none of that worked against Nzinga, they tried it again, and then again, for 40 years. It never worked. By 1657, in her 70s, Nzinga negotiated a peace treaty with Portugal from a position of sufficient strength that the Portuguese agreed to her terms, withdrawing their puppet ruler of Ndongo, returning captives, acknowledging her sovereignty over Matamba. She had outlasted multiple Portuguese governors. She had survived invasions, exile, the deaths of allies, the betrayal of subordinates, and 4 decades of sustained colonial pressure. She died in 1663 at approximately 80 years old, in her own kingdom, on her own terms. The Portuguese records of the period, which are extensive because they were trying to defeat her and needed to understand her, describe her consistently in terms of frustration and reluctant respect. She was, in the words of one Portuguese official, impossible to predict and impossible to defeat for long. That is the colonial administration's assessment of a woman they spent 40 years trying to eliminate. Think about what Nzinga's story means in the context of everything you have been told about this period of African history. The dominant narrative of 17th century Africa, the narrative that was constructed by European colonial powers and transmitted through European educational systems, is one of passive victimhood, of African people as objects of history rather than subjects of it, of a continent without sovereignty, without strategy, without the capacity for the kind of political and military sophistication that Europe's rulers were displaying in the same period. Nzinga demolishes that narrative completely. She was not exceptional in the sense of being a unique anomaly. She was exceptional in the sense that she was extraordinarily skilled. But she emerged from a tradition of African governance, African diplomacy, and African political thought that produced leaders capable of this level of sophistication. The tradition was real. The capability was real. What was constructed was the story that it wasn't. The next time someone tells you that African history before colonialism was primitive, remember a woman who ordered her attendant to kneel so she could sit on their back and negotiate as an equal with a colonial governor who had brought one chair on purpose. Remember that she then spent 40 years making that governor's successors regret the entire enterprise. Remember that she died at 80, in her kingdom, undefeated. Your ancestors did not wait to be liberated. Some of them spent lifetimes making sure liberation was never necessary. Nzinga was one of them.